The AFC North is one of the best divisions in the NFL. Today I'm going to be previewing every single team and talk about how well I think they will do. And at the end, I'm going to go ahead and give standings, record predictions for each team in the AFC North. So if you like that, go ahead and subscribe, like, and share because I'll be doing this for every single NFL team and every single NFL division. So let's go ahead and get right into it. Let's first take a look at their offensive stats from 2022, starting with their total yards per game, 349.1 total yards per game. That was 13th, pretty good. Total passing yards, they were 22nd with 202.6 passing yards per game, but they were 6th in total rushing yards per game with 146.5 a game, and they were 18th in points per game with 21.2. So they had their highs, they have their lows. Obviously, we know they're one of the best rushing teams in the NFL with Nick Chubb. So let's go ahead and talk about their offense now. Or actually, let's talk about their additions before we get into that. Dalvin Tomlinson, Agbania Okoronkwo was a big addition for the defense. Juan Thornhill, and they also traded for Elijah Moore. Then when it comes to the draft, they got Cedric Tillman, Siaki Ika, DeJuan Jones, Luke Weipler, and Dorian Thompson-Robinson. The departures, Jadeveon Clowney, Kareem Hunt, possibly. We'll see, because, he could resign, he may not. Taven Bryan, Greedy Williams, and Deion Jones. So those are some of the bigger departures, the bigger additions for the Cleveland Browns this year. So let's talk about their offense. And the thing with the offense is I think it definitely got better. And obviously you got the man in the middle, Deshaun Watson. How good is he going to look? Is he going to look like a possible top 15 quarterback? Like I think he is? Will he possibly look like a top 10 quarterback, in which I think he can be? He may not be the same Deshaun Watson he was in Houston, but he can be a dang good quarterback that can help the Cleveland Browns make the playoffs and win and possibly even win a Super Bowl. And the Browns could be really good this year. I think Deshaun Watson's the biggest key pieces of how good the Browns are this year. But he's got a pretty good offense around him. I like the offensive line of Jedrick Wills, Joel Bitonio, Ethan Pocic, Wyatt Teller, who I think is a really good guard, and Jack Conklin. So I think you're fine when it comes to the offensive line. You're fine when it comes to the running game. Nick Chubb's going to be able to help take some pressure off of Deshaun Watson. He'll definitely get the ball a lot. I think he's the best running back in the NFL. So I think that 100% helps. And then you go ahead and you get Amari Cooper. And you have Elijah Moore. The David Njoku is pretty solid. And then Donovan Peoples-Jones. So yeah, it's gonna be interesting. And Deshaun Watson, when we're talking about him, he didn't have a good start. Which is pretty bad. But I think he really became more of the Deshaun Watson we started to see at the end of the season, which I think is really interesting. And now I think if he can progress on that, he'll have another offseason with this offense. You're bringing some talent here. I think this is gonna be really interesting. Again, Nick Chubb, who had 1,500 rushing yards last year. He had 5 yards per carry, and he had 12 touchdowns last year. Really good. You talk about some of the receivers. Amari Cooper, 1,100 yards, 9 touchdowns. Again, very good. And I think Amari Cooper is definitely one of the best wide receivers in the NFL. And then you have David Njoku, who had 628 yards and 4 touchdowns, who should be a big part of this offense next year, in my opinion. He had a pretty good season last year. So, again, I'm excited for that. Now let's go ahead and talk about the defense. Their defensive stats from last year, they're 14th in allowed total yards per game, which was pretty, right in the middle, which is, good. They were 5th in total passing yards allowed per game with 196.2, which, again, very good, top 5 in that. Now, they weren't good stopping the run. They're 25th in that, 135 yards allowed per game when it comes to the rushing. And then not the best when it comes to allowing total points per game with 22.4. So, again, it's going to be interesting to see this defense. I think it's gotten better. I think they made some good moves to upgrade this defense, and I'm very excited for this defense. Let's go ahead and talk about it really quick. You look at the defensive line. This is going to be a big defensive line, defensive move. You have Myles Garrett. You have one of the best edge rushers in the league who went ahead and got 16 sacks last year. You bring in Zadarius Smith from the Minnesota Vikings who had 10 sacks last year, and you got a really 1-2 punch on those edges. I like bringing in Dalvin Tomlinson. Jordan Elliott should be pretty solid. And then I like the linebackers. Anthony Walker, Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah, those aren't top 10 linebackers. Maybe not even top 15 linebackers. But with how the defenses work now, you can hide those guys. And I'm not saying they're bad, but they should be serviceable to do pretty well in the middle of the defense. And then you talk about their secondary. You have Denzel Ward, who got 3 interceptions last year. You bring in Juan Thornhill. You have Grant Delpit at the safeties. I love Greg Newsome. I love Martin Emerson Jr. This defense should, in my opinion, be top 10 when this season's all said and done. And I'm very, very excited about that for the Cleveland Browns. And you go ahead and talk about some of the depth there on that team, again, which I'm very excited for. Siaki Ika in the middle. I think he should be a pretty solid nose tackle. Agbo Okoronkwo, he should be pretty solid. I mean, he was probably going to start off the edge if it wasn't for them getting Zadarius Smith. Now, him coming off the bench, if Myles Garrett, Zadarius Smith needs a break, needs a little bit of rest, for a few plays, you bring him in, I don't think too much is going to change. It's not going to feel like anything happened. It's not going to feel that Myles Garrett isn't on the field. It's not going to always feel like Zadarius Smith isn't always on the field. And I find that, again, very interesting, and I can't wait to see that and how they rotate the guys. Again, this is a very good defense, starting-wise, depth-wise, and in my opinion, the Browns should have a top 10 defense when the season is all said and done. So again, I'm very, very excited for the Cleveland Browns. The Pittsburgh Steelers had a very interesting season last year, and let's go ahead and talk about it. Let's start with the additions in the offense. And the Pittsburgh Steelers had a pretty decent offseason. I kind of like some of the moves they made. So let's go ahead and talk about them and talk about the preview here for next season. Let's talk about the additions. Nick Kwiatkowski, Keanu Neal, Isaac Sumalo, Patrick Peterson, Cole Holcomb, Larry Ogunjobi, and Allen Robinson, who they traded for. When you talk about the draft, I think they had the best draft in the NFL last year. Broderick Jones, Joey Porter Jr., Keanu Benson, Darnell Washington, and Nick Herbig. And then you look at some of the departures, some of the main departures in Cameron Sutton, Devin Bush, and Terrell Edmonds. But I'm not really worried about that when you add all these guys together on the new team of Pittsburgh. You got Patrick Peterson, who could move into a safety role, possibly. I'm going to be, I'm excited to see Patrick Peterson. They paid some money for Isaac Sumalo to start. I like Cole Holcomb as a pretty decent linebacker. But I really loved their draft. Broderick Jones, you traded just a 4th-round pick to move up and go over the Jets and get your offensive tackle. Then you go and somehow get Joey Porter Jr. with the 1st pick in the 2nd round. I don't know how he fell in the 2nd round, but, he did. And then you get Keanu Benson, who I think is one of the most underrated players in this draft. I thought he was pretty much almost a 1st-round talent, in my opinion. You get Darnell Washington in the 3rd round, who I think can be a very good tight end. And if he's not this amazing pass catcher 5 years from now, he'll be one of the best blockers, one of the best blocking tight ends in the NFL for a very long time, and will find himself on teams no matter how bad of a pass catcher he is, to be honest. And then you get Nick Herbig in day 3, which I think was a very good pick as well, and you pair up the brothers. So, again, very big fan of what they did this offseason. Let's talk about the offensive stats from last year. They were 23rd in total yards per game, 24th in total passing yards per game, 16th in total rushing yards, and 26th in total points per game, which was not good. They had a decent, rushing game. That was pretty solid last year. But when you talk about everything else, they're bottom 10 in the NFL when it came to total yards, total passing yards, and total points per game. So that definitely needs to be upgraded or get better. Obviously some of that has to do with Kenny Pickett. I know Najee Harris was a little injured. Their offensive line wasn't the best last year. But let's go ahead and talk about their team now and what the projected offense is. Their offensive line, I think, has gotten a lot better. You get Broderick Jones, who's a rookie. Isaac Sumalo is a solid guard. Cole Mason, I really love James Daniel. And you get Chukwuma Okorafor. I think I said that name. Okorafor. There we go. And again, decent offensive line. Nothing, crazy, but it's doable. It really is solid and can protect Kenny Pickett. And, Kenny Pickett is going to be interesting. Last year, he went ahead, had 2,400 yards, 7 touchdowns, and 9 interceptions in limited play. He didn't start the whole season, but he came in, a tad bit early. I wouldn't say tad bit early, but earlier than, some of the other guys like Desmond Ridder and Sam Howell. But he's going to be the starter, obviously, coming in to this next season. And they did a good job surrounding him with solid weapons. You talk about Najee Harris. He had 1,000 yards. He did have 3.8 average per carry, which I think should go higher. He did have an injury last year, and he had 7 touchdowns. So I think Najee Harris should be fine, for fantasy-wise, just just a good running back wise. I think he will be very good, and I think he'll kind of have somewhat of a breakout season next year and show why he was a first round pick. And then you talk about the offensive weapons when it comes to receiving core. You have Deontay Johnson, who had 800 yards. Now, he didn't have 0 touchdowns, but I think people are overrating that. I think overrating the touchdown number, because he was, again, a very good wide receiver. And I hope, another offense, Kenny Pickett the starter, another learning this offense, which I think is, I don't know why Matt Canada is still their offensive coordinator, but he is still their offensive coordinator. And I think Deontay Johnson should be just fine. You had George Pickens, who was a great pick in the second round, 800 yards, 4 touchdowns, made some stellar catches. And it's going to be exciting for George Pickens next year, and I cannot wait to watch that. They bring in Allen Robinson from the Rams, who was not good last year. He was the wide receiver 2 in that offense, and then eventually somewhat of the wide receiver 1, which was bad. But I think as a slot wide receiver 3, I think that's serviceable for the Pittsburgh Steelers. I do think so. So let's go ahead and talk about some of the depth on this offense, because I think some of the receivers are definitely interesting. And Calvin Austin, who was a rookie last year, who is now coming into his second year, and I believe he was injured. I could be wrong. They got Nate Herbig on that offensive line, who I think is pretty decent. I totally forgot to talk about Pat Freiermuth, who I think will be an absolute stud of a tight end, who I already think is a stud of a tight end, and maybe even the top 10 tight end in the NFL. And so he should definitely help out Kenny Pickett next year. You have Jalen Warren as a backup running back to Najee Harris, and when Najee Harris was injured, and they definitely went to Jalen Warren a lot this past season. And I wonder if they keep that up, but in my opinion, I think I would still try to go all in with Najee Harris. Obviously, he's gonna take his reps, but I think Najee Harris should be the starter, to be honest. I don't know if you heard that, but there was a motorcycle outside. So I'm excited for the offense. I think it's gotten better. I don't think it'll be a prolific offense. I don't think it'll be a top 10 offense, but it should definitely get the job done to win some games. So let's go ahead and talk about their defense. So when you look at last year in their defensive stats, they were 13th in total yards allowed per game, which is pretty solid. 19th in total passing yards, 9th in total rushing yards, and 10th in allowed total points per game, which, again, they had a pretty solid defense. I think it's, again, a pretty good defense. Yards per game isn't bad. Obviously, passing yards isn't the best, and I think they definitely made some upgrades there to hopefully whittle that down a little bit. And then, obviously, rushing yards, they have a pretty good defensive line, and we all know that. So, again, pretty decent defensive season, but I think it can definitely be a lot better come this year when you got Minkah Fitzpatrick at that free safety spot. Obviously, Minkah Fitzpatrick is an absolute beast of a safety who had 6 interceptions last year. 6 interceptions. And when you look at the middle, Cole Holcomb, I think, is a pretty solid middle linebacker. Landon Roberts is a nice middle linebacker as well. And now you also have TJ Watt, who, I think he played like 10 games or something like that last year. So, he didn't have the sack number as you usually see with TJ Watt, who did just tie the record, not last year, but the year before that with, I believe, Michael Strahan, if I'm not mistaken. I like their defensive line. I think it's solid. Obviously, you got the veteran in Cam Hayward, who still is a very, very good defensive lineman. He had 10.5 sacks last year, which is pretty nice. Larry Ogunjobi is a nice defensive tackle. You're going to have Keanu Benton in the middle as a nose tackle, defensive tackle. I think he can do both. I think he's a great pass rusher. I think he's a good run stopper. So I'm very excited. And then you talk about the outside guys and the cornerbacks. You're going to have Joey Porter Jr. You're going to have Patrick Peterson, Levi Wallace. I think this is the weakest part of their defense is the cornerbacks, because we just don't know how well they're necessarily going to be. You have Joey Porter Jr. I think he'll be great, but he's still a rookie. Patrick Peterson, obviously we know how good he was in his prime, but he's not in his prime anymore. He's a very good zone coverage guy, which, again, one of the worries about that is, like, Steelers don't run that much zone. They're more of a man coverage guy, man coverage team. And Patrick Peterson at this age, this athletic ability that he's now with, obviously just because he's older, I'm interested to see how well he'll do in man coverage. And then you got Levi Wallace, who I don't think is a bad cornerback at all, So you got some pretty decent guys. I like Marvin Leal as a depth backup on that defensive line. Obviously, we talked about rookie Nick Herbig, who I think is pretty good. One of the more underrated guys, in my opinion, is Corey Trice Shout out to Brett Coleman there. He's a pretty good corner who they got in the 7th round. Keanu Neal, I think he'll be a nice safety. He can play a little bit of linebacker as well. So again, I like their depth. The Nick Witkowski, I think, is a solid linebacker, definitely backup linebacker. So this Steelers defense is going to be really fun. And I think they'll be better stats-wise, record-wise. Maybe not. We'll talk about that, at the end of the video. So, again, interested. I think their defense definitely has a chance to be top 10 next year again. They lost some guys like, Cameron Sutton, who I think could be a hole in this defense for this year. But again, we'll see. And let's go ahead and talk about the next team. Let's talk about the Baltimore Ravens now, who made the playoffs and had a pretty disappointing end to their playoffs with the return touchdown by Sam Hubbard, I believe. Yeah, Sam Hubbard. And, obviously they didn't have Lamar Jackson for like the last 5-ish games. Maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less. But the Ravens had a interesting offseason. They didn't, shock the world with any of their, free agents, their picks. That's why when you look at the additions and departures, there are not too many big moves. You bring in Odell Beckham, who I think is really interesting. Rocky Ya-Sin. You drafted Zay Flowers. You get some more help. For Lamar Jackson was what it seems to be the biggest thing that they wanted to do this offseason with the backup receivers they brought in too. Brought in Trenton Simpson, in my opinion, was the second best linebacker in this draft. And so maybe that's a signal that maybe Patrick Queen won't be here long. And then you get Caillou Blue Kelly, who should be a decent backup cornerback. But then you look at the departures. Ben Powers, who went to Denver, then you have Marcus Peters, maybe. I don't know. He's still a free agent. They still could bring him back. You lost Josh Oliver, backup tight end. And then also Calais Campbell, who they let go of, which that doesn't necessarily make the most sense for me. I like some of the guys they have as a backup, the young guys. But I still think Calais Campbell is an absolute beast of a defensive lineman now in Atlanta. So let's go ahead and talk about the Baltimore Ravens and their offensive stats last year. They were 16th in total yards per game, 28th in total passing yards per game. They were 2nd in rushing yards per game and 19th in total points per game, which, this all makes sense. They're not, they should hopefully be a better passing offense this next year with Todd Monken now as offensive coordinator. But obviously their rushing yards, they got a good run offense. Obviously you have probably the second best rushing quarterback in the NFL with Lamar Jackson. And so I would like to see the total points will go up, and that should with the more weapons they have, yards, and obviously passing yards as well, as I believe they definitely should be more of I wouldn't say more of a passing team necessarily, but I would expect it to grow. I know Lamar Jackson has talked about wanting to become more of a passer, even though he's not a bad passer. He is a great passer, but maybe you pass the ball maybe a little bit more than you have designed run plays for Lamar Jackson all the time, because they do design run plays for Lamar a lot, to be honest. So let's go ahead and talk about their offense, which I think is solid. I think it's a solid offense. You take a look at their offensive line. You got Ronnie Stanley, who is a great left tackle. Ben Cleveland, serviceable guard. Tyler Linderbaum, one of the best centers already in the NFL. I like Kevin Zeitler, and Morgan Moses is a solid right tackle for now. He's a stopgap, and obviously not long term. And so obviously you have Lamar Jackson, who had 2,200 yards last year, 17 touchdowns and 7 interceptions. Obviously he played a lot less games, so that wasn't the full number of a full 17 game season. You got Mark Andrews, probably their best receiver, at 800 yards and 5 touchdowns. And then you look at the new revamped wide receiver room with Odell Beckham, who's coming off the injury. Zay Flowers coming from Boston College. Rashad Bateman also coming off an injury, who I think is, in my opinion, their best wide receiver. I think Rashad Bateman is the best wide receiver in this receiving core as of now. I think Zay Flowers probably will. I wouldn't be surprised if Zay Flowers turns out to be that by the end of the season. But I'm a big Rashad Bateman fan. Absolutely huge Rashad Bateman fan. And obviously you got J.K. Dobbins, who may not be playing this year. He's holding out with that franchise tag, I think. Or I don't think it was a franchise tag, but he's holding out, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And if it was either a franchise tag or that he's just holding out for a new contract, which I don't necessarily understand. He's a great running back, but his situation is not that he's necessarily, he's too good for the money he's getting. It's more that I want you to be healthy, show me that you can stay healthy for a good chunk, 90% of the season, and then I'll look to pay you. He's had some injuries. So I understand why the Ravens wouldn't be going out of their way to pay J.K. Dobbins, especially when they got Gus Edwards, who I'm a big fan of Gus Edwards. I think he's also a pretty good running back as well. So now you look at the offense, you got some depth guys. Also, I want to talk about Patrick Ricard, a good fullback for the Baltimore Ravens. You talk about some of the receivers. They added Nelson Aguilar. They added Laquan Treadmill. But the guy I'm really interested in when it comes to these backup wide receivers is Devin Duvernay. He played a lot, and I was just looking at some of the highlights, and I'm like, this dude is good. I think he's one of the most underrated wide receivers in the NFL. And I think that's some good props. And then I like Daniel Faalele, right tackle. I think he's from Minnesota. Like, he's like 6'7" or something. It's insane. I like Isaiah Likely as the backup tight end there. And I think that's it when talking about this depth here. So this offense should be a lot better. And I expect this team to be a playoff team, just a playoff offense. And I wouldn't be surprised and I wouldn't be shocked if this is a top 10 offense this year. So let's go ahead and talk about the Ravens defense now. Last year, they didn't have a terrible defense. 10th in total allowed yards per game. They were 26th in allowed passing yards per game, which obviously wasn't good. They were 3rd in total allowed rushing yards, which is pretty solid. And allowed points per game was 3rd with 18.5. So they have a good defense, obviously, on the ground. They're good at not allowing teams to score points, but their passing defense is a work, and I'm definitely interested in that. I think they should try to bring back Marcus Peters, which I think he's not the greatest cornerback. He's not how he was. He's not in his prime anymore, but he's a solid cornerback to have, in my opinion. And I think I would say, I think it's not safe to say, but I would take him over, Rock Ya-Sin, to be honest. So that, obviously I think they should definitely look into that. But let's go ahead and talk about this defense here. You have Marcus Williams and Cal Hamilton, who I think are two great safeties. And Cal Hamilton going into his second year, I expect big things. I expect big things from Cal Hamilton. And so, again, I'm excited for that 100%. You talk about the linebackers. Obviously, they have Roquan Smith, who had an absolute heck of a season. 86 tackles and 2 sacks. When you look at his stats, Patrick Queen is definitely he is a very interesting player to talk about. Some people love him, some people don't like him. I think he's an average linebacker. I know it sounds cliche or kind of just boring, but he can do some very, very good things right. And I think, he could possibly at the end of the season deserve a good contract from the Ravens, but he could very well not be on the Ravens by trade deadline day or by after trade deadline, if that makes sense. And, now you talk about the cornerbacks. Marlon Humphrey, obviously one of the top cornerbacks in the NFL, who had 3 interceptions last year. Rock Ya-Sin and Brandon Stevens. I would like for them to bring back Marcus Peters or make any other move at cornerback, because I'm not the biggest fan of their nickel and obviously Rock Ya-Sin. Rock Ya-Sin's a good cornerback, 3-4. You can come in on times. If you want to run 6 guys on the field for the secondary, you can bring in Rock Ya-Sin, but as a starter, I'm not the biggest fan. I like their defensive line. I'm definitely interested in their defensive line. We talk about Justin Matabuke, who I think is a solid defensive line guy. Michael Pierce, who I think is an absolute beast at defensive tackle. You got Odafe Owe, who should have a good season coming off the edge. And you look at some of these other guys. Trenton Simpson as a rookie. Where is he at? David Ojabo, also probably going to be coming off the edge. Travis Jones from UConn, who I'm a big fan of, who I think could be a pretty good defensive tackle, nose tackle on the interior. Talked a little bit about Caillou Blue Kelly. Geno Stone is a decent backup safety, in my opinion. So, again, they got a good defense. I'm not saying it's going to be top 10 or anything, but at least I think it's going to be serviceable. I think it's going to help win games. But I don't think they're going to rely heavily on the defense, especially when they got a good offense as well. So, again, big venom of their safeties. That's their best part of this whole defense is Marcus Williams and Kyle Hamilton. And I'm expecting big things from that duo in the secondary. And so I'm excited. Obviously, you got an off-season Roquan Smith, and so he should be a great linebacker next year. And I'm interested to see what this defense looks like. It's not going to be crazy, not top 10, but it should do enough to help win games when this offense with Lamar Jackson is that good. So, we'll see what happens with the Baltimore Ravens. Let's now talk about the Cincinnati Bengals. Let's look at their offseason additions and departures from last year. They brought in Orlando Brown Jr. to that's going to be, interesting. Obviously, a good tackle in the NFL and definitely helps out their offensive line. Bringing Irv Smith Jr. to replace Hayden Hurst, Cody Ford and Sidney Jones are both pretty good backups, in my opinion. Now you look at the draft, you look at some of the rookies they brought in. Myles Murphy, who should have a good impact, should definitely see the field a lot early for the Cincinnati Bengals. DJ Turner as a cornerback, Jordan Battle as a safety, Charlie Jones and Chase Brown as a wide receiver and running back. So I like their draft. I think it was pretty solid. They really went for what kind of defense they want to go for. And now you look at some of the departures. You lose your top safeties in Jesse Bates and Von Bell. We'll see how they adjust when it comes to that. They have Hayden Hurst, Eli Apple, Samaje Perine, who also are all leaving. So those guys, they're definitely replaceable. I don't think they're as big as the Jesse Bates and Von Bell moves, and that they let go of. So we'll see what happens and what effects that could have to the defense and offense. So let's go ahead and now talk about last year for the Cincinnati Bengals in their offense. So they were 8th in total yards per game, 5th in total passing yards per game, 29th in total rushing yards per game, and they were 7th in total points per game. Obviously, we know they have one of the best offensives in the league. When obviously it comes to the passing game, they have one of the, if not the best receiving core in the NFL. Also, they got one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. So, we'll see what happens there. So let's talk about their offense. Obviously, you got the man, Joe Burrow, Joe Cool, Joe Burr. A top 3 quarterback in the NFL, in my opinion. Last year, he had 1,400 yards. He had 35 touchdowns, and he had 12 interceptions. So, Joe Burrow obviously had a great season last year. Looking to succeed and keep going from that, I think he has a decent chance to win MVP next year. So, we'll see with that. Obviously, now you have Joe Mixon, who is very inconsistent, but he is a dynamic football player. We know how good he can be in the passing game, the run game. He can do a lot of things, but how consistent will he be? Because we know he can go off for 5 touchdowns. He did last year versus the Panthers. And now, now you talk about this offensive line. We'll get to receiving core last, but bringing in Orlando Brown Jr., obviously a great move for that left tackle spot. Cordell Volson, Ted Karras, Alex Kappa are pretty solid interior offensive lines. And then you look at the right tackle spot of Joni Williams, who may have possibly been traded or released because he didn't want to play right tackle, but I think at this point in the offseason, we're just going to assume he's fine with playing right tackle because this is projected offense from our lads. And then obviously you talk about this receiving core. You talk about Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, Tyler Boyd, Irv Smith Jr. This is a good receiving core. This is good weapons for the Cincinnati Bengals. Jamar Chase had 1,000 yards last year, and I think he missed a few games last year. 9 touchdowns. T. Higgins, 1,029 yards, 7 touchdowns. Tyler Boyd had a great season. So you can't go wrong. You cannot go wrong with this offense, who should still put up great numbers, still should be the biggest reason why they make the playoffs and, spoiler alert, in my opinion, win the division. And they're doing everything greatly. They're doing everything greatly. And I think I'll give props to kind of going off of their last offensive line and kind of building that up, because they obviously had a really bad offensive line the year they made the Super Bowl. And then last year, they bring in some guys like Lalo Collins, who had a disappointing season. And they're like, okay, let's get the guys. Let's get Orlando Brown Jr. Let's make sure we're getting good offensive linemen, which I think they did pretty well and should be decent enough to protect Joe Burrow. Nothing crazy, but it's definitely made a big upgrade with Orlando Brown Jr., who obviously won a Super Bowl with the Kansas City Chiefs. He's going to the dark side for, now with the Bengals. So, again, I'm very excited for this offense. This should be another top 10 offense, even top 5 offense next year. So let's go ahead now and talk about the Cincinnati Bengals defense, which, I think is there's some questions. There's some questions about their defense. You take a look at last year. In allowed total yards, they were 16th. Allowed passing yards, they were 23rd. And allowed rushing yards, they were 7th. And allowed points, they were 6th. So they had a decent defense, when it came to rushing and points, yards per game. So, again, the passing yards, I think, is, obviously a question from last year, but also a question now that I think this defense, in theory, has gotten worse. On paper, has gotten worse. They're not incredibly bad, but... not incredibly bad, but not the best. You start with the safeties. I think that's the biggest thing for the Cincinnati Bengals. is you lose Von Bell, you lose Jesse Bates. How do you replace him? And you can't just replace him like that in 1 year, especially if you're not making insane free agency moves. You got Dax Hill from 2022 draft, Nick Scott, who's going to projected starter. You have Jordan Battle. So we'll see how those guys kind of rotate between the safeties, but they're obviously not going to replace Jesse Bates and Von Bell right away. But over time, I think they can definitely grow and be a solid safety, I guess, duo, trio. And so we'll see what happens with that. You have Jermaine Pratt at linebacker, Logan Wilson at linebacker. They're a good 1-2 punch at the linebacker position. You look at the defensive line, who I think is probably their strongest asset on the defense, their strongest group. Trey Hendrickson, who had 8 sacks, DJ Rader, BJ Hill, both very good interior defensive linemen and should hopefully help with that run defense that they, poor run defense they did have, if I'm not mistaken, yeah. No, the good run defense, my bad. And then you got Sam Hubbard, who I think is a good defensive lineman. And then you still have Myles Murphy, who could probably find his way as a starter come at the end of the season. And then you look at the cornerbacks. It's not great. I like Mike Hilton. I like Chidobe Awuzie. They're nice. Nothing crazy. We'll see what happens with Cam Taylor-Britt. They brought in DJ Ivey from the draft. So I think that's the biggest question mark is their secondary. How good is that going to look? I know Mike Hilton's going to be good. I know Chidobe Awuzie is going to be good. But what is Cam Taylor-Britt, Nick Scott, Dax Hill, Jordan Battle, DJ Ivey? What do they all look like? And I think that's one of the big things you're betting on when it comes to this defense. But overall, they got a good defense. Obviously, Myles Murphy is a backup. Just of a side, who I think is a nice defensive lineman. Obviously, I know he got a lot of hate at the end of the season last year because he pushed Patrick Mahomes to give the Chiefs a chance to win the game, which they ultimately did. Linebackers, I think there are some decent backup linebackers. And DJ Turner also has a cornerback. I don't know if I talked about him. So this defense is solid. Nothing crazy. Not a top 10 defense. I wouldn't say a bottom 10 defense. But I think, if anything, if there's a thing limiting them of going far, it would be the defensive side of the football. So we'll see what happens there. We'll see what happens to the safeties. That's the biggest question when it really comes down to everything. So we'll see. Let's talk about the AFC North standings in my prediction for this upcoming year. I have the Bengals winning the division at 12-5. I don't think that's crazy to say. I think there's definitely some tough games in there. Obviously, this is a very tough division, so I don't see any team going 13-4 or what would it be, 14-3. But the Bengals should probably win the division. But I wouldn't be surprised if the Ravens win the division because they're close. And obviously, the biggest thing is a healthy full season of Lamar Jackson. If they get that, they could have a good contention of possibly winning this division. I mean, they were this close to winning it last year. It was almost settled by a coin toss, and maybe that wouldn't be the case if Lamar Jackson was healthy. Who knows? So we'll see that's going to be a fun battle to watch throughout the season, the Bengals and the Ravens. The Browns, I think they should make the playoffs with this record. I haven't done every single team's division record or record prediction yet, so this could not be in the playoffs. This could be in the playoffs. I think they'll be borderline in playoffs, but they could miss it as well, and I wouldn't be surprised as well. The biggest thing is obviously Deshaun Watson. What does Deshaun Watson look like? A full off season. He's back. None of this. He's doesn't know the players. He's had 2 years off of football. No, those are not excuses anymore for Deshaun Watson. He has to go out there and make plays. And obviously the Steelers 7-10, finishing not without a winning record or a non-losing record. With Mike Tomlin as head coach, and I think that comes to an end this year. Unfortunately, but, I don't think the Steelers necessarily can keep up as much with this division. Now, could they definitely make the playoffs? 100%. They could definitely make the playoffs. And I wouldn't be surprised, we see the first full division to make the playoffs. It's possible. But again, this division is very tough, and I don't know how much, is Kenny Pickett really going to be that good to where they can genuinely make the playoffs and be able to beat some of these other teams with very good quarterbacks. I think Kenny Pickett's going to be great. He's going to be fine. But I just don't know if I can, see him being that good to where they beat some of these other teams. And that's kind of my thought there for the division standings. So hope you guys enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if you want to see your favorite team in your division and talk about that. Give a record prediction. So go ahead, leave a like, subscribe, and share. I just said that. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace out.